Good morning and welcome to Independent Schools Queensland's webinar on managing student health conditions. I'm Courtney Downard from the School Services team at ISQ, and with me today I have Callum Robertson, the Coordinator for Community Programs from the Asthma Foundation, Queensland and New South Wales. Behind the camera I also have Jackie Dawson, who is part of our Education Services team, and her focus is on student wellbeing. So originally today we were going to discuss the administration of medication more broadly in light of proposed legislative changes. However, those changes have not yet come through. So we have been in consultation and we will be advising you in the future when we know more about what's going on in that space. So therefore today we have asked Callum to come along and we've decided to focus on asthma management. First, some housekeeping. We have muted all of your microphones just to avoid any excess background noise. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation, so please feel free to unmute yourself at any time. You can do that in the bottom left-hand screen of your corner of your screen. Ask any questions as we're going along. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can also type your questions into the text box. So now I will hand over to Callum to present to you on asthma.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I was happy to hear that we've got quite a few different schools tuning in today. Asthma is, of course, one of those conditions which is sort of very high on the list of prevalent sort of chronic conditions within a school environment, and one which requires, a lot of management within a school environment and education to make sure that, I guess, we're providing the best care possible for our students. So today, what I guess I'll be going over most importantly is our asthma school guidelines document, which was a lot of work, I suppose, in ensuring that we had a standardized way of ensuring that all schools, regardless if they were, Catholic, independent or state-driven, they had the same access to a set standard procedure of actual guidelines with asthma management, because, asthma is governed by some certain regulations, such as the administration of medications. But in terms of how schools actually manage their students with asthma day to day, is quite variable. And that's something, with this document, which has been approved by Queensland Health, Education Queensland and other independent school bodies have approved sort of for use within a school. So, great. So this is just a PDF document, I suppose, guys, and this is what the asthma school guidelines is. So I really wanted to run through the asthma school guideline and run through them a bit with you. Of course, this is a free document for you to download, Jackie. I think I sent you the link to where that is. So I guess that'll be communicated widely with you. And I really think it's a great opportunity for you all to follow along with some of the things that we've recommended in here. So table of contents, I suppose. We've tried to break it down really simply into sort of a broad sort of education basis of, what is asthma? Because obviously when you understand the condition, it makes it a lot easier both identifying it and treating it within a school environment. That includes things like asthma control, level of symptoms, and some of the important trigger factors within a school environment, because asthma is extremely variable to each individual, I suppose. And I was at a conference just recently where they don't actually like using the word asthma anymore. They like to say asthmas, because it's been found that there's over 66 different types of asthma in each individual, which is a really good justification why we need to sort of know about the condition, I suppose. So after that, we've got managing an emergency at school. So that's going to be if we find a student who's running into, say, an asthma attack, we know exactly what to do. Now, there's regulations which say, all schools need to have at least a few people trained in asthma first aid, just like many other conditions such as diabetes and anaphylaxis. We always recommend that all staff members in any school are trained in asthma first aid, because if we think about the prevalence of asthma, it's about 1 in 10, which is extremely large. It's probably even more than that in primary school age students. So if you've got a class of, say, 20 to 30 students, it's probably highly likely you'll have at least a few students with asthma, which I guess is a really good justification why it's sort of at the top of the list of chronic health conditions to know about. So asthma first aid is probably one of the biggest things in an emergency procedure, and I'm hoping on the back of this we can sort of organise a lot of asthma first aid training for school staff, which is one of the free services that we actually provide for schools. And, if you do happen to have a school in a very remote or distant location, obviously, there are issues with getting out to those in person, but we also offer the training in an online platform which covers all the same information. So I guess any information you want about that or booking in training, you can ask Jackie, and I guess she'll pass your details on to me, and I'll get in touch with you to organise that training, which I think will be really good moving forward. And then we've got some more stuff in there, which is, sort of, there's always going to be issues around, medications within a school environment or stigmas maybe people hold. But what we really want to make clear is, our use of, blue-grey reliever medications for asthma. They're a very safe medication to use. And, if you have been trained in asthma first aid, regardless of what position you have at the school, you're able to both purchase and administer this medication within a school environment. And that's what asthma first aid training does for you. And then one of the important little topics here, which is this develop a school asthma emergency procedure. Because, asthma management is very variable depending on each school that you're at. We always recommend that, a school has a set plan in place, what to do if, if an asthma emergency actually occurs. So we'll get going, guys. We'll just have a look at this. So this is, of course, what I'm showing you is the document that you'll have access to. So I'm just showing it to you on the basis of hopefully you'll be having a look at it through your own time as well. So what is asthma? Asthma is a long-term chronic health condition, which is probably at the simplest. There's a much more complex definition, but it's a condition of airway narrowing. Okay, so people with asthma have hyper-responsive airways that react very negatively to things which they really probably shouldn't. So that can be things like, cold air we find, and you'll probably see this around the school environment, but winter acts as probably one of the biggest prevalence periods of asthma flaring up. And what we call by a flare up is just an exacerbation of someone's asthma. And you'll see down the bottom here, that's sort of the things that we look out for within a school environment and in general as well. So we've got shortness of breath, chest tightness. Okay, so when we've got such narrowed airways, extra muscles around our chest are working to try and get air in and out of lungs, which really aren't working in the way they should. Shortness of breath, a wheeze, which is that high-pitched whistling noise you can hear when, the airways narrow. It changes the frequency and the noise of the air coming out. And then a cough. And what a lot of people say to me is, when they've done asthma first aid training, they say, oh, a cough. Kids cough and adults cough as well. I suppose I cough. I don't have asthma. But, that's why it's really important to actually know of our students who do in fact have asthma, because if we see symptoms like this, that would indicate to us, okay, that student's coughing all the time. That may be an indication that their asthma is worsening, okay, because asthma can worsen over a very long or short period of time. And we know if a student's asthma is worsened to an airway which looks somewhat like this, they're at a much higher risk of having an actual asthma attack, and quite a severe one, which is what we obviously want to avoid. We need to know how to respond to it, but obviously the best thing in health is preventative measures in avoiding that from happening in the first place. So what we'll get in an airway that has asthma or uncontrolled asthma, we'll get a lot of airway inflammation, okay? So just like anything else, a very red, swollen, inflamed airway. We'll get extra mucus built up within the airway. And then on top of that, we've got this muscle tightening around the outside, which you can see is outlined here. It's good to have muscles around your airways, I suppose. If you didn't, they'd become floppy and you wouldn't be able to breathe. However, when you have asthma, those sort of muscles can really work against you, I suppose, in constricting down and blocking off air entering the airway. So that's what an airway is going to look like during an asthma attack. And of course, for your information, I suppose, this is what you need to use with a spacer in order to give that student the relief and respond to that asthma attack, I suppose. And what this medication is doing is just relaxing those tightened muscles around the outside of the airway, which are causing the student to have shortness of breath, chest tightness, and they can't breathe. When you're having an asthma attack, put simply, you really can't breathe. So I'll keep going like that. Of course, guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Do we know how many people we've got at the moment?
25.
About 25, so that's really good, guys. So asthma control, we'll go over this a little bit, I suppose, but good versus poor asthma control. Now, you'll see on this document, there's a lot of different signs and symptoms you can look out for that would suggest maybe a student's asthma is flaring up, and flaring up means getting worse. One of the best ones to look out for, though, is how much the student is requiring of their blue-grey reliever medication. So if anyone doesn't know what this medication does, okay, like I said just previously, it relaxes the tightened muscles, but it doesn't prevent asthma from occurring. It just responds to symptoms. So what we know is that if you've got a really red, swollen, sensitive airway, you're going to get a lot of muscle tightening, therefore requiring a lot of this Ventolin or Asthma, blue-grey reliever medication. On the basis of that, that's why we say that how much they're needing of this is a really good tangible way of determining where that student's asthma currently sits. So if you have a student that's using this medication every day, okay, they're getting symptoms, they're requiring it every day, well, that's a huge indication that, okay, what's going on here? The student's asthma is not very well. Maybe we need to communicate to the parents or identify what's going on with that student, because if they're needing this all the time, they're at a much higher risk of having quite a severe asthma attack, okay? So the guidelines say that if someone is requiring this more than twice a week, okay, with asthma symptoms, so let's say they required it on Monday, they required it on Tuesday, then they required it on Thursday and Friday, well, that would indicate poor asthma control, because they really shouldn't be needing this medication more than twice a week with asthma symptoms, okay? What you'll find, particularly around times of physical activity for all the PE teachers and that sort of thing, or school sports carnivals, students will take this medication before exercise as a preemptive measure to open up the airways, okay? But that everything like that should be outlined on an asthma care plan, which is what we should be receiving from parents. So if we see students using this more than twice a week, guys, that's a huge indication that, okay, something's going on with this student's asthma. Maybe we need to intervene a bit. Then, of course, poor asthma control would mean requiring this all the time or more than twice a week. A lot of symptoms, and the symptoms we talked about before was chest tightness, wheezing, shortness of breath, okay, and coughing. So those are the things we really need to look out for in our students with asthma. And like I said, asthma is very variable to each individual. Some will get worse in spring because of the pollens in the air. Asthma acts as a very allergic condition to many people. However, most people we find will get worse in winter, okay? And obviously with winter comes a lot of illnesses, particularly within a school. We know if a student gets the flu or gets a virus, it's very likely that's going to flare their asthma up. So we need to be hyper vigilant of our students around those times of the year, around winter and around times of sports carnivals and throughout spring as well. So I'll keep going. So triggers, I'll touch on this just quickly, guys. But within a school environment, the two biggest ones that I guess which are very, very well defined is exercise, okay, and colds and flus. Now, probably most of us, if we've been a teacher for a while or have had to monitor students during times of exercise, we'll see that exercise is the biggest trigger of asthma, more than likely. A few reasons for that, I suppose. One of the reasons being is when we exercise or rigorous exercise, we don't try and get our breath through our nose, we try and breathe through our mouth. Mouth breathing is really bad for asthma because if we think about someone with asthma has very sensitive airways, okay, if they're bypassing the role of the nose, which is to filter, moisten, and sort of filter the air, which sits easier on their airways, if they're needing to breathe through their mouth, they're bypassing the body's natural process of filtering air, okay? On top of that, we get a lot more of air flowing in and over our airways, which will dry them out and cause them to constrict. That's why exercise is so huge in asthma, okay? So if, there's times of exercise, cross-country, PE, we need to be more vigilant around that time, and we need to have quick access to reliever medication because it's an at-risk time, I suppose, for a lot of students. Colds and flus is the other one. I mentioned that. Not only do we get a blocked nose, like I said, and breathe through our mouth, but the other one is that when we've got a cold or a flu, our inflammatory processes are already very high, and people with asthma have a very, I guess people like to think, potentially, not everyone, that if you have asthma or you have allergies, you've got a sort of a weak immune system because you react to these things, which is not correct. It's actually you've got a very elevated immune system, which is hyper responsive, which reacts far more negatively, but far more intensely than what mine would or what someone with well controlled asthma would. And then you'll get a whole host of others. And like I said, there's over 66 different types of specific asthmas. Okay, they're called phenotypes, I suppose. I won't bore everyone with that. But in spring, pollens act as a big one for asthma. And the other big one, I guess, comorbidity, I guess you could call it, is hay fever. So and food allergies and that sort of thing, because probably about 80% of people with asthma, students included, will also have another allergic disease of some description, okay, which is huge. And that's a huge risk, because often when a student might have anaphylaxis, chances are they might have asthma as well, which makes it doubly hard to control that student within a school environment. And then we'll keep going. I mean, pretty much anything you can think of could be a trigger for someone with asthma. Emotions, anything you name. Deodorant sprays and that sort of thing are another big one. So we'll keep going. Exercise and asthma, I think I've touched on that enough. Medications. So this is one that I wanted to talk to you guys about quite a lot, because the way in which our policies, I guess, operate within a school environment in terms of accessibility and administering medications within a school are quite variable. Very much what I've seen, and I go out to a lot of schools, every school's got a slightly different way of going about it. What we would recommend is we're very much of the sense that we encourage, if a student's of an age, okay, in which they can self-administer their own medication, we would recommend that, okay? Because if we've received some form of formal documentation, like an asthma care plan, which we should have from parents for every student, that says they can administer their own medication, that's a very good thing to support, not only for autonomy for that student, but also we're ensuring that if they run into trouble, they've got their own medication there and we don't have to bring ours, okay? We should have our own medications there just in case, because not every student's going to have their own medication, which is why we need to have our own school supply. But it's really good for students to self-administer their own medications. Obviously, only if they can do it properly, which is an issue in itself with students, because let's face it, students often do a whole host of weird things when it comes to things like puffers, okay? So you really need to monitor it as well. So in our asthma medications, which you'll see outlined in this document, they're sort of broken into two broad categories. It's far more intense than this, but for argument's sake, it's relievers and preventers, I suppose. Like I said before, relievers, these blue-grey ones, we use them when we have symptoms. They act as a Band-Aid effect. They don't prevent asthma from occurring. They just respond to it, okay? When we think about preventive medications, which is this little one down here, as you can see, they come in a range of variety of colors and different delivery devices. And if you have asthma or have a child with asthma, you'd probably see these more than a staff member. For the fact is, preventive medication is often taken morning and night or every day to ensure that your airways stay at a point where they're not so inflamed and sensitive. So then if you're exposed to, say, a trigger, okay, you don't react as if you would if you weren't on preventive medication. So preventive medications are extremely effective in preventing asthma, as the name would suggest. However, preventive medications are great, but they take a long time to work. Okay, so if a student runs into an asthma attack, for example, we don't want to be giving them a preventive medication, because that's not going to give them the relief they need. That's why there's Ventolin and Asmol, and that's why we use it in a school environment, and that's why it's used in Asthma First Aid. So some names of preventive medications that you might have heard. Now, depending on how your school works, some schools, of course, have bordering students and that sort of thing. When we go away on things like school excursion, then we might see some of these medications occurring. We often don't realize that students actually take a medication every day to keep their asthma under good control. Now, of course, if we were to see a student using this every day, like I said, that's an indication of poor asthma control. That may indicate to us that student's not taking their preventive medications like they should be, okay? And maybe the parent's not even aware of that. What I often find is students are terrible at communicating things to their parents. So if we see that, it's always good that we can also take not the responsibility, but really assist that student in communicating that back to the parents to make sure they're on top of everything as well. So signs and symptoms, managing an asthma emergency at school. So this is obviously really big and very important for everyone to know. And this is sort of just going over the asthma first aid procedure. Now, if you'd like to have Asthma First Aid or something like that for your school, of course, we would recommend all staff complete Asthma First Aid. If you do complete Asthma First Aid with the Asthma Foundation, you get a certificate valid for 3 years. Okay, and what that certificate really does, I suppose, is give you both the authority, okay, to both purchase and administer blue-grey reliever medication within your school. Okay, and every school should have, you know, an in-date blue-grey reliever medication, and they should have that with a spacer as well, which I'll go into a bit to spacers. If I'm not going to go through first aid today, I will talk to you about spacers as well, because parents should be providing it with their students. So if you are interested in organising this for your school, you know, get in contact, you know, with Jackie, and she'll pass it on to me, and or you can get in contact with me as well once we sort of push out all the resources, I suppose. That should be done every 3 years, like I said. So we'll go through there a bit. So school equipment, I suppose, or what we should have at our schools. Now, all schools, you know, are really required under the 1996 Drug and Poisons Act is to have at least one blue-grey reliever medication for use at their school, okay? And that needs to be in date and have doses left in it. Obviously, it needs to be in date, and obviously it needs to have doses left. If you're using a medication that doesn't have doses left, it's not going to do a whole lot for that student, of course. We also should be carrying spacers with us in any way that we do it. So what we often find is schools will have a separate asthma first aid kit, I suppose, which needs to be highly usable and transportable around different times. For example, if we had a school sports carnival, we want to make sure that we've got all of our medications down on the oval per se, so it's quick access. An asthma attack can go from mild to severe or life-threatening very quickly, which is why we need quick access. Having your medications like Ventolin, for example, locked away in a storage cupboard or very far away from students is probably not going to cut it, because if that student doesn't have their own medication, it's going to be life-saving for them. So it needs to be quickly accessible. This medication is very safe to use. Okay, it's very safe to use on students that don't even have asthma as well. Okay, so people who sort of have an allergy to salbutamol, which is the drug inside this, okay, is extremely rare. And what we often say is when staff members are unsure, if you've had asthma first aid training, regardless if that student's known to have asthma or not, you can still give them that medication, because that's what first aid training does. It gives you the authority to do that, okay? School purchase of spacers. So we should have spacers. Now, if you don't know much about spacers, and what I usually find is people think that spacers are only used for children. That's probably the biggest thing. You'll get the same benefit using a spacer with puffer medications, okay, that you would as a child as you would an adult. So it should be used across the whole spectrum of senior students as well as lower grade students as well. I guess the reason for that is that if I was to take this blue-grey reliever medication without a spacer, okay, and I'll demonstrate that with really good technique. Hopefully you can pick it up on the image, okay? So that would be taking the cap off, giving it a really good shake. You should always shake your puffer before use. Breathing all of my air out before I inhale, starting to inhale, shooting a dose and keep inhaling because it comes out extremely quickly, which I'll demonstrate. Good technique, which isn't hard, which is very hard, I should say. And we know about 80% of people don't use their delivery device as they should. So this is how it should look. Hold my breath for 5 seconds, then breathe out, okay? The reason to start breathing, then shoot it, is to try and coordinate it because it comes out extremely quickly, okay? Now, that's with good technique. Many people would think, oh, yeah, you'd probably get most of that dose because you did, you know, the puffer with good technique. Let's face it, students are going to do a whole heap of, you know, random things. I don't know, spray it under the neck and that sort of thing as well. But even with really good technique, I'm only going to get up to 10% of that amount of medication actually into my airways. Only about 10%, which isn't a whole lot. Now, if you think about a student having an asthma attack who really requires medication, okay, and they've got an airway which is already constricted, they're not even going to be able to take a big breath to get a good inhalation to begin with. So using a puffer alone in an asthma first aid situation, okay, is almost useless. It's better than nothing, but it is almost useless. Now, if I was to do the same dose but use a spacer, Okay, so this is a small volume spacer. If you want to know where you can buy these really cheap, you can buy them from our website, or most chemists will have them. These are around $8. Good thing about these spacers here, they can be clicked in half, and you can drop your puffer in there and then click it back up, so you've got everything ready to go in one place, I suppose. Now, if I'm to do the same dose, which is 1 puff or 100 micrograms of salbutamol, but use it with a spacer, okay, which I'll demonstrate, give it a good shake, put it in the spacer, breathe out, and then breathe in 4 times in and out of the spacer, what we call tidal breathing, which is a lot easier for people with asthma who can't take a good breath. So I'm probably going to get up to 4 times the amount of medication through the same dose with the spacer, which is a lot more, which is why generally, you know, in asthma in everyday situations is paramount. You are using a spacer. And, you know, it's probably going to be a lot less than 10% if someone's having an asthma attack and it has a constricted airway, because you're not going to get a large amount of medication down in there anyway. So using a spacer is paramount. Some other spacers on the market which are really good, particularly for schools, are these cardboard ones, which simply pop up, and then you can put your puffer in there and use it like that. It's not as good, okay, but it works extremely well. A lot of people ask me what's the best way to clean our spacers for the school. It's important to note that a spacer is a single person use only for a school. So if a student's required our spacer, we can't wash it and then put it back or anything like that. Most schools will have some form of policy in which they'll get the parents to reimburse them for the spacer, or they'll just give it to the student. Okay, so that's important to note. A lot of schools don't understand that. I don't particularly understand it either. It's just a way of ensuring that, you know, you're not spreading germs or I mean, covering, I guess, anything that could go wrong. So if a student's needed our spacer, we can't really put it back. Some schools will, and it's not the end of the world, but that's just what regulations say, I suppose. So, I mean, that's really important to note when using our medications. Now, of course, not only should parents be providing blue-grey reliever, but they need to be providing a spacer as well, okay? Because you can, I mean, I think I've just justified how important spacers are. I guess the reasoning behind why that happens, okay, it seems like a very simple thing. When you put a puffer straight into your mouth and shoot it, comes out at over 100 kilometers per hour. What's going to actually happen is it's going to hit the back of your throat, your tongue, and or the top of your mouth. And what happens when that takes place is you don't inhale the medication, you swallow it. And when you swallow a medication, it doesn't go into your lungs. When you put it in through the spacer, okay, it slows the medication down, so it's trapped in there, ready for that person to breathe in and out. For cleaning spaces outside of the school environment for students, parents or students should wash their spacer in warm soapy water at least sort of once a month and allow it to drip dry if the soap sud's still on. The reason for that is a spacer, because it's plastic, can often have static electricity in it, okay? And when something's got static electricity in it, if I put a puff in there, it's going to draw the medication to the sides of the spacer and we can't inhale it, it gets stuck, okay? So it's good to have a bit of a film built up on the inside. For your sake in a school environment with your spacers, don't worry about cleaning them. These ones and most spacers on the market now have addressed a static electricity issue, okay, and are ready to go straight out of the pack. So don't worry about that. I guess another thing, actually, just while I'm on spacers, what a lot of people will do, now in Asthma First Aid, which you will learn or you have learned in the past, Asthma First Aid is 4 puffs of our blue-grey reliever medication, one at a time in a spacer, taking 4 breaths in and out of each puff, okay? What I find a lot of people do is if they hear 4 puffs, what they'll get their spacer and go 1, 2, 3, 4, inhale, which makes sense, I guess, you know, if you're worried about a student and you want them to take the medication really quickly to get rapid relief, that would make sense in theory. But particularly small volume spacers, they're only built to hold 1 dose of medication. If I'm to dose this spacer with, say, two puffs, 1, 2, Okay, what actually happens within the chamber, in the spacer, is the particles hit each other or hit the sides of the wall and become enlarged. And when a particle's too large, we can't inhale it. We can only inhale very fine particles. We end up swallowing them like we would with this, rather than inhaling them. Okay, so it's very important. These are things to look out for with your students as well as using in first aid. It's one puff at a time through the spacer. Okay, if a student's well, they can take one big breath. Okay, or if they're not so well, or in first aid, it's 4 breaths in and out, tidal breathing. It sits a lot better on their airways, puts a lot less stress on them. But for argument's sake, always one puff at a time. Very, very important to remember with your spacers. So there's a lot to know about spacers, I suppose, and that information is not always that accessible, but you'll find everything like that in this document I've got here. So we'll keep going. You'll see that in this actual document, location of asthma emergency. Okay, so our equipment's always highly accessible. Okay, you want it in very close proximity to a student. And what we often find is, unfortunately, a lot of schools won't take asthma as seriously as it should be. And if a student, say, had a bit of, a mild asthma attack or some asthma symptoms, say, down on the oval, for example, they'll send the student up to sick bay to get the medication, all right, which is a big no-no, I suppose. If a student's having an asthma attack, or what we think is an asthma attack, you don't want to put any more strain on what they already have on their airways. So it'd be about keeping them there and bringing the medication to them. Okay, you don't want to put any unnecessary strain. I hear a lot of stories of disgruntled parents saying they sent my student up to the office when he was having an asthma attack. So this document's very good for streamlining that as well. So we'll keep going, guys, because quite a bit. Now, roles and responsibilities, that's very important. I suggest, when you have a look at this document, you do look at roles and responsibilities. What's good about this document, there's some supporting hyperlinks here to not only asthma, but managing students with specialized health needs. Okay, so that includes things like diabetes, food allergies, anaphylaxis, and that sort of thing, which obviously no one is more important than the other, okay? It's just about a sort of a holistic or whole care of students' disabilities or diseases. And then the administration of medications in a school environment. So that's a regulatory document, I guess, which you can look at, but everything I'm telling you today comes out of those regulations. Roles and responsibilities of the principal. So this is the principal, but also any staff member as well, to be honest, because we've all got the responsibility of looking after students, regardless of what sort of, I guess, role you have to play in the school. So developing a school emergency response procedure. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, schools really struggled with this because they didn't quite know what the difference was between an emergency procedure and everyday sort of things. And what we often found is schools were a bit anxious around times of, particularly large schools, around times of school sports carnivals where, I guess the possibility of a student having an asthma attack was very high. On the basis of that, we also made another document. This is called the School Sports and Asthma Pack, which I'll actually go in and, if I can use the system, and have a quick look at. The School Sports and Asthma Pack, I guess, is used to sort of address what's going on with that by giving you an accessible piece of equipment, which I guess predominantly acts as a checklist. But this is the School Sports and Asthma Pack. Okay, so what it is, it's a document of supportive resources for schools to use, predominantly consisting of, if I scroll down here, a checklist for school sporting events. So this is something that you don't have to use, but we would recommend you use if you've got a school sports carnival. Like I said, exercise acts as a major trigger of asthma and is why we created this document in the first place. So this is a free pack which you can order from us, and I've sent the link, which will be communicated to you all as well. So this is just a ticker box, I suppose, prior to the sporting event, all the things that we really should have in place. There was already one of these similar documents in other foundations, but we found it was too complex. The recommendations were ridiculous and they weren't sort of practical for staff to do. So we really made it more concise, I suppose, which are all very practical things that you can do in your school environment. So things like, at least one staff member attending the sporting event has completed first aid. Very simple, particularly when, we recommend all sort of students do asthma first aid training. Then we've got on the day of the sporting event, and there's a bunch of things in there which are very easy to follow that you can use, I guess, to ensure we're providing the best possible care for all those students with asthma, particularly around times of school sports carnivals. I'm just going back into the guidelines document. Another huge responsibility within a school environment is communicating with parents, okay? What we often say is with students with asthma, they're only as good as their parents, to be quite fair. So if a parent isn't, giving their student the right care, whereas, going to a health professional to get an asthma review, they're only going to be as good as their parents. So if parents are providing a blue-grey reliever medication, a spacer, and an updated plan, as you can see here, that's everything that we really require them to do for us to ensure all of our students have the best opportunity to get good control of their asthma. So you can see here, review each student's asthma plan. You've probably all seen an asthma care plan of a student, and it's something that we really should be ensuring that we receive. So an asthma care plan is really important as a document which really does outline to us exactly what to expect from that student. Like I said, asthma is such a variable condition, and it can be very confusing. So an asthma care plan just gives us that peace of mind as to what to do with the student. One of the big things that I get questions about is a care plan will say, for example, in an asthma first aid situation, give at least 20 puffs of Ventolin before calling an ambulance, which is what a GP has provided, which is obviously extremely confusing for parents and for school staff predominantly. What I say is if a student's having an asthma attack, you can always do the 4x4, okay, set community procedure for asthma first aid, which is what you're taught in asthma first aid, because that holds the authority to be able to use despite what's listed on an asthma care plan. For everyday symptoms and medication use, we should be following a care plan, okay? But in a first aid attack, we can follow that, or we can use what we know, all right? That's really important to note. Roles and responsibilities of you guys, teachers, or any sort of supporting staff, administration staff, business development officers, it doesn't matter if you work in a school environment, is knowing your students that have asthma, okay? Like I said before, asthma is a very variable condition. We need to know our students have asthma to know what to look out for with each of those students. Like I said, coughing, okay, is a big symptom of asthma, but most students will cough at some point throughout the year. So that's why we need to identify those students and we need to look out for them, particularly around times of, particularly in winter and spring seems to be the worst times. Flu season is the worst for asthma. If a student does happen to get the flu, a very likely chance their asthma is going to flare up. That's why we need to know of the students that have asthma in order to know that, okay, there is a chance that their asthma is going to be worse. And then what comes with that is there's a chance they're going to have an asthma attack potentially. Hopefully not, okay, but there is a chance. Knowing what to do in an asthma emergency. So, I mean, that's the reason for asthma first aid training, and it is the reason why we're funded federally to provide free asthma first aid training for schools. So just got a question here, Dewey.
While you're talking about that,
Yep.
Someone's put through a question asking what amount of time is needed to be allocated for asthma professional development and
Yep.
first aid training.
Sure.
How long does that take?
Yeah, sure. It's a really good question. So the set first aid, training that we provide only takes about an hour to complete, and that's once every three years. So it's not a whole lot of time. Like I said before, if you're not in a school which is highly accessible from metropolitan areas, this is available online, okay, which will only take about an hour to complete. It can be found at www.asthmaonline, all one word, .org.au. All of those will be communicated out to you as well, which you can complete in your own time. But about an hour is all it takes. So that's a really good question. So what is your view on pro-air HFA and anaphylaxis? Could this induce anaphylaxis? What is the procedure to follow when this happens if a student has a reliever for an attack? Yeah, I guess that's extremely rare. Look, to be honest, you won't see that very regularly. What we often say is, because anaphylaxis is so frequent with asthma as well. If you're unsure of whether a student's having an anaphylactic attack or an asthma attack, we would always suggest doing anaphylaxis first aid first, which would be the EpiPen, followed by your puffer and spacer. I was at a school just recently in which a student had actually died because they weren't sure if it was an anaphylactic attack or asthma, and they gave the EpiPen, but they needed blue-grey reliever medication, which they didn't give because they didn't actually know the student had asthma. And that student actually ended up having a fatal asthma attack. So, I mean, I can't answer that question too directly. If a student, for example, is anaphylactic or has an allergy to, say, salbutamol or something like that, then that would be outlined on a plan, and they'd have a separate reliever medication specifically for that, and that would be communicated to the school. The other medication probably that it will be used in first aid the most, which you don't really have to worry about in a school environment, is called Bricanol, which contains terbutaline instead of salbutamol. I hope that's answered your question all right. But, there are a lot of other medications on the market now as well for asthma because it's constantly growing. So we'll keep going. So implement a risk management procedure. This is exactly what I talked to you about with that school sport and asthma pack. Okay, and links to that sort of thing will be sent out to you. But, I guess to be fair, you don't want it to consume all of your time having all these different procedures for everything. If you can have most of your staff trained in asthma first aid, encourage a process of self-administration for medications for students who are of age, monitor those students, and have accessible medications of your own. That's the best thing you can do for your school for asthma emergencies, and asthma management in general. So those are the biggest things that we would recommend. Some schools, I guess, are very finicky about allowing students to administer their own medications. Okay, and if a school's like that, then, and which is okay, because what we find is, depending on the school, some students will overuse their medication and they don't like that, or they'll have stigmas about the medication. The medications still need to be highly accessible. They can't be locked in one location. For example, for those schools, what we would recommend who have a strict policy of no self-administering, the medications would be kept in their classroom with that teacher or something like that. But we're highly of the standard that students should self-administer if they're of age and they can do it appropriately, which obviously I showed you is hard. That's why we just need to be on the lookout for that, and that's why it's important doing asthma first aid training for not only our own facts about how to do asthma first aid and the correct procedure and that sort of thing, but we're monitoring what students are doing within a school environment as well. And if you got any questions, guys, throughout this, please ask again. I guess you'll just prompt me if another question comes through in the chat box, and I'll answer it, because that's what this is about. It's about a question and answer type period as well, guys. So the roles and the responsibilities of the parents, which I'll go over. Like I said before, oftentimes a student will only be as good as their parent. If the parent's very onto them about good adherence to their preventive medication, provide them with a spacer and reliever, that's great, but not all parents are like that, of course. And what I actually often find is, you may not be aware, but the main active ingredient within most preventive medications for asthma is what is called a glucocorticosteroid. And you can imagine if a parent hears the word steroid, it sends a huge alarm bell off in their head. They think, oh my God, I don't want to give my student steroids, which is not the case at all. A corticosteroid, which is in a preventer puffer or preventive medication of any description, doesn't work the same way as an anabolic steroid does. Okay, so the student isn't going to get very muscular or something like that. I don't know what their concerns are, but a corticosteroid inhaled is extremely safe. And that, I guess that's probably up to the Asthma Foundation, ensuring parents know that. But we often find is if a parent holds that stigma or holds that understanding that they don't want to give their students steroidal medications, oftentimes the student is the one who pays for that, and the school does as well, because you have a student with poorly controlled asthma who's requiring this frequently. The other medication, and you may have seen this in the news, it was on a 7:30 report, is what's called Singulair or Montelukast, which is a non-steroidal preventive medication for asthma, which is really good for exercise-induced asthma. It was found a while ago to, in very rare cases, cause psychotic episodes in students, mostly around depressive thoughts. And that over, I guess, maybe a 5 or 6 year period, there was about 50 or 60 students that showed these, or just children in general, because it's only on the PBS up until the age of 12. And as soon as parents heard that there was potentially the risk that it could cause psychotic effects, they took the child off the medication, even though it wasn't causing the child those side effects. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of parents won't need many excuses to take their student off preventive medication, which in terms affects us at school, which is why we need to have a good management procedure within our school and have our own medications as well. Another question?
Yeah, question there. It just says, what if the parent is not forthcoming with an action plan?
Yep.
After the school's asked for one.
So if the parent's not forthcoming, without an asthma action plan, it really is a regulatory thing that parents, if the student's got a medication at school, there needs to be some sort of document provided to the school that they can administer the medication. Otherwise, there's no, I guess, authority that you're able to give them that medication outside of, completing Asthma First Aid training, of course. So you just really need to make it clear to them that, working with that parent, and probably the biggest one I see is what quality of plan do we need to see in order for it to meet regulations? Because there's so many different asthma care plans out there, or asthma action plans, and oftentimes what we find is the GP will just provide the school with a bit of scribble on a piece of paper, which says give 2 puffs of medication whenever, and that's it, which isn't going to cut it. However, unfortunately, regulations within that area suggest that if there's been at least a letter from the GP, requiring medication or the administration of it at least, that's fine. So you need something. What we always say is giving parents a blank asthma care plan to fill out at the GP when they see an asthma review is probably the best thing. Now, I'll just actually show you that. So an education and care plan, this is what we recommend for schools to use, which you can get off our website, and it can be given to the parent to get filled out. You don't have to put a photo of your child in there, but this asthma care plan, it's got the child's name, date of birth, and all sorts of things, what to look out for, symptoms, and any of their medications that they're on. So it's just a 1-pager. Name of medication and color, dose number and puffs, and then of course it's got the doctor's details and emergency details over here as well. And then on the back, which is good, it's actually got the asthma first aid procedure, okay? Just as an extra reminder. So we would suggest, and we would love it if we made that mandatory, I guess, for an asthma care plan across schools, but it never works out like that. And quite frankly, we don't think it's acceptable just having a bit of scribbled paper. You need something, okay? And that the parents really should be providing that. However, we would really hope that it would be, something better than what a lot of schools do actually receive. So we got another question, did we?
We have another question. Does a school first aid kit for camps require a blue-grey reliever?
Yeah. So anywhere you're going with students, okay, you should be taking reliever medication with you. Now, that's a really good question, because it's even more important to note, because sometimes when you go away on camp, you'll also have the responsibility of ensuring students take their preventive medications, which can, and there's oftentimes it's the first time a staff member will actually see a preventive medication. But I would suggest, yes, it's very vital that you always have your own medication just in case a student runs into trouble. Now, if you go to an external environment, something like an excursion, for example, that's even more important, because students may be exposed to triggers, okay, something that might flare their asthma up, to what they're not used to at school. A new plant, maybe they're exercising more, because obviously, on camp, you run activities and that sort of thing, and students becoming ill. So those are high risk I guess, events. That's why you need to bring their asthma care plans, you know, and a reliever puffer, just like you would an EpiPen, for example, as well. So we got another. I hope that's answered your question. If it hasn't, just ask another question or get me to answer it better, I suppose. Do we have another one?
Yeah, is a school able to ask parents of students with asthma to attend the school session of training with the Asthma Foundation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I don't see it frequently. I guess you could. There's nothing stopping you. And Asthma First Aid that we treat and asthma management is, I guess, is usable outside of the school environment as well. So if you think that's a good idea, you know, parents are more than welcome to attend it. That's fine. We try and do a lot of work with parents. Now, also, if you want parents to have more information, we actually run what's called a 1-800 asthma helpline. So by phoning 1-800-ASTHMA or 1-800-278-462, you get to speak with an education officer. Okay, so if you're worried that the parent doesn't have the right amount of information about asthma or isn't providing the right stuff, you can refer them onto that service and we'll get in touch with them or speak to that parent to make sure that they're providing you with everything that they require and are upskilled on asthma. So that's a free service that you can prompt staff members to use. So I got another question or a few other questions? No? Okay, sweet. So I hope that's answered your question. So just to wrap that up, yes, you really should. I would say it's even more important when you go away on excursion to bring the school's medications with you. And of course, bring it with a spacer as well, okay, just to make sure. And we want, you know, parents providing at least some form of care plan. Like I said, if you can provide them with a blank asthma care plan, that may help prompt them to fill out something that's more acceptable. But they should be providing at least something to the school. So we've got 5 minutes left, guys. Thank you all again for attending. So I'll just go down here and just talk to you again about asthma first aid training for school staff. So what does it come under? It comes under the sort of 1996 Drug and Poisons Act. We've already had a question here. So after actually receiving asthma first aid training in person, or if you do it online through our services, what you get is a asthma first aid certificate emailed to you, which you can actually take to a pharmacy, give it to the pharmacist, and they'll be able to provide you with a puffer. Ventolin or Asmol is what we use in asthma first aid. So that's what you can actually receive for your school. Just going on puffers, what we find a lot of the time is people ask, how do I know if it's empty? Which is a great question because they don't have a counter on them. What you can do, at least to check the expiry, the canister will come out and the expiry will be on the canister. The best way to look out for is, you know, if there's still puffs left, we always suggest having a medication log inside your first aid kit or whatever it may be. So you log how many puffs you've been using of your puffer medications to make sure you stay on top of it. Other little things, if you haven't been doing that, which we would recommend you certainly do, is you'll be able to feel it and see it. Okay, so if it's empty, it'll make more of a fizzing noise than a puffing noise, and there'll be less visual medication coming out of it. Funnily enough, these used to contain the gas CFC, which was obviously shown to cause, you know, holes in the ozone layer and all sorts of things. But what CFC did in the canister is it caused the medication to float when you dropped it in water. So, of course, if it floated, that would mean there was medication left, I suppose. That was removed at least 10 years ago, but some staff members still swear by the dropping in water. I'd spoken to a lady who hadn't been aware that CFC was taken out. So you can imagine every single thing that she dropped in water would sink. So she probably threw out a bunch of puffers that still had plenty of doses left in them. So for argument's sake, medications log and, you know, visually looking and hearing it as well. And if you're at all worried, just replace it. Asmol is a bit cheaper than Ventolin. Okay, you should be able to get it for around $7 from a pharmacist, which for a life-saving medication isn't a lot of money. We had a few questions about the asthma first aid training. That'll really just go over, you know, what is asthma in the school environment, things that have similar things to what I've talking to you about, but probably most importantly, the asthma first aid procedure and how to identify a student of having an asthma attack, which will take about 1 hour to complete. Okay, and it'll provide you with all the necessary and confidence, I suppose, to be able to respond to a student suspected or having an asthma attack. So we're sort of coming towards the end, so I won't really move on to too much more stuff. Maybe it's a good time for more questions.
We've had a few questions. Do you use a spacer with preventive medication?
Yeah, so that's a really good question too. So any puffer medication, you may or may not know, preventers come in a range of different delivery devices, turbuhalers, accuhalers, because asthma is a very lucrative industry for pharmaceutical companies to make a new, fandangled device. But for puffers, doesn't matter if it's a reliever or a preventer, you get the same benefit using a spacer. So that's a great question. So for example, maybe Flixotide is something that we often see in younger students and students across the board. Yes, using it with a spacer, you'll get the same benefit. So that's a really good question there.
How many times can you use the disposable spacer for the same student?
Like the cardboard ones?
I'm not sure whether it's...
So, I mean, I'm assuming you mean disposable by this cardboard one. For the same student, I guess, it would just be a visual thing. There's no sort of information that says, replace after X amount of times. You'll find that there's a little flap back here, and you can visually, I mean, this one looks pretty bad. I don't know if you can pick it up because I've been using it for a while. The only issue with disposable spacers such as these cardboard ones, so to answer your question, play it by ear. If there's any, holes in the cardboard or in the plastic, I would suggest replacing it, and probably replacing it maybe after, 10 to 20 times or something like that, of just, because obviously that's hygienic as well. But the issue with disposable spacers is this actually costs more than this, which is a big barrier. So we often say is these are great because you can also give it to the student afterwards, and they crack in half. So you can put your puff in there. But for these ones, I would only get rid of this when the valve, so you'll be able to hear that there's actually a valve in there that stops me breathing back in. If that valve gets damaged, you should replace it. And of course, if any of the silicon's coming away or being damaged, I'd replace it. But these will last a long time. Yep, so good question.
Is it okay to keep the blue-grey reliever in the first aid kit, or does it need to be kept at low temperatures?
So, I mean, like most medications, it's a cool, dry area, I suppose. But I'm assuming that's where you would keep your first aid kits anyway. But the answer is yeah. So you can keep it with your other, first aid equipment. That's fine. We find most schools prefer having a specific asthma emergency kit, which is something that we provide as well to schools, because you can put your spacers, your puffers, and a medication log in there as well, just to keep it all together, I suppose. But to answer your question, yeah, they can be very much so. I would make sure you don't keep it in any moist locations, okay? Moisture is bad because in your puffer, the little, little nozzle where the medication residue can build up in there and it can become clogged. So keep it in a dry location is probably the most important thing for it. But, keeping it in a cool, dry place is the best practice for, looking after your medications.
And just back on spacers, how effective are the cardboard disposable spacers versus the plastic ones?
Yep, good question. So cardboard spacers are obviously far more effective than this alone. They're going to be a little less effective than this, than a plastic spacer, just because there's slightly less volume in there. And also there's more direct areas where medication can escape when you shoot it in. But I'd say you'd get, 2 to 3 times the amount through this as you would this alone. So they're still extremely effective and they're perfectly fine to use. We say these are a fine spacer to use. If you're going to use the best spacer possible, it'd be that big volumatic football shaped one, which, you've probably seen it, very old because there's so much volume in it, but that's not practical anymore. So this or this is great. And we would suggest this, but these are great as well, particularly like the excursion question. These can be really great because they're highly transportable and you can even put that in your pocket, to be honest. So great question.
And last question, how many puffs are there roughly in a puffer?
Yep. So a puffer, when bought off the shelf, will contain 200 metered doses. So 200 doses. So 200 puffs of medication. I wouldn't suggest using it down to the bone per se. So, if you get to around, we usually say, around, close to that, at least having 10 puffs left, replace it because, this is a very safe medication. And in a first aid situation, you may give a student up to 20 puffs of this. So you want plenty of doses left in your puffers because you never know when a student might need a lot of that medication. But for argument's sake, 200 doses is what these puffers will come in. Yep, great.
So that brings us to the end of our webinar this morning. Thank you for attending, and thank you, Callum, for all of that information.
No
I
worries.
know I found it very useful as an asthmatic. I actually learned a lot from you today, so there we go.
All right.
We will be sending out via email all of the guidelines and the asthma management form that Callum was talking about, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. So if you would like to distribute it to other staff, you can also do that. And we'll also send out contact details for Callum if you would like to run Asthma First Aid training at your own school or with your parents. So thank you again, Callum.
Thank you very much.